All right, welcome to Highways and Hazmat, the podcast where we dive into the world of rules, risks, and realities of commercial vehicle and hazardous materials transportation. I'm Brent Moore alongside with my co-host and friend Clay Greene. So our plan is to each week dive into the world of hazmat regulations, trucking, transportation, everything that's going on out there. Mix in some real stories with, I guess what you could call some expert insights so you can stay informed, maybe even a little entertained while you're out there on the road. So just to kick this thing off, being episode one, we'll do a quick introduction of kind of who we are and kind of why we decided to do this. So a little background on myself. I spent nearly 20 years with the Georgia Department of Public Safety, specializing in commercial vehicles and hazmat inspections, company investigations. I spent a little over a decade as an associate staff instructor for the FMCSA's National Training Center. So I've been around the block on that for a little bit. Took a retirement in 2020 and since then been working with some companies trying to help them get right and stay right, helping them out with compliance investigations and all that kind of stuff. Kind of had an idea of kind of things that we've seen out here and questions that we get periodically is like, hey, what's the best way to reach everybody and maybe try to help some folks out. So that's kind of what our goal is with this. Clay, I'll let you take it over and tell a little bit about yourself and kind of where we come from and all that good stuff.
Absolutely. I don't know about the expert part. The expert is has been in a drip under pressure. But yeah, I'm looking forward to doing this with Brent. We have a long history together. So my story, I've spent 36 years working for the government, recently retired from the federal government. Last 31 years dealing with commercial vehicle safety, hazmat safety. And I was a young deputy sheriff in the early 90s and was called in the captain's office on the carpet one day and told I was going to truck school to learn how to inspect commercial vehicles. And I went to school and they started talking about a fifth wheel and I was looking for another tire. Out of that, it was born and kind of developed a passion for it. I found that I'm one of the rare people that government regulations are easily understandable and I can easily translate them to help people better understand them into plain language rather than the governmentese that confuses us all. But I did that for a few years, local law enforcement level, inspecting trucks and kind of wound up working for the state of Georgia and did that for about 5 years. And then the feds kind of made me an offer I couldn't refuse and wound up retiring from FMCSA in a variety of positions there. Over 23 years that I was there and retired as a division administrator in the state of Florida. And I had a very, very rewarding career, a very, very successful career, and want to take all my knowledge and do what I can to help people as well. And so, very excited when Brent asked to join in this, and we can share stories over these podcasts of the totally unbelievable stories of the DOT lore and kind of confuse, or clear up confusion on some of the truck stop myths and the junk you hear out there on the road and all that kind of thing. But we've worked together for quite a long time, and hopefully we will keep you very entertained with this. But you'll learn we both have a very weird sense of humor. But that's part of me growing up watching Mel Brooks movies all the time.
Yeah, that's I think that's one unique thing about us is we're both pretty passionate Mel Brooks and Leslie Nielsen fans. So that usually that has a tendency to work into, I guess, pretty much every public speaking engagement we've ever done and pretty much every class we've ever taught. So
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
There you go.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you brought up too, talking about how you got to call in one day when you was a deputy sheriff, and how you're going to truck school. It's amazing, like if you look at the points in your career that kind of made changes to what you thought your career trajectory was going to be. I kind of had one of those moments in 2000. I had just made sergeant and was assistant station commander up in Ringo at the inspection station up there, and kind of like you get one of those phone calls one day that you just can't say no to. And,
Mhm.
I'll go and call the name. It was Major Wayne Beck called me at home one day and told me that, hey, I'm the major over the north area is about to retire, and I'm gonna be over the entire state. I'm gonna need some help. Are you interested in it? Well, me as a young sergeant getting a call at home from the major one night, there's some things you just don't say no to. So my answer was, yes, sir, boss. Where do you need me? When do you need me to be there? And so, that kind of started off. And, then I thought he lost his mind one day. He called me in his office and he said, you seem to have a pretty decent knack for these regulations and, picking up things and understanding things and stuff like that. But I want you to go to school and start teaching this stuff. And I thought, I didn't say it, but I thought, boss, lost your mind on this? Is like, I'm the guy that likes to be in the back of the room. Don't look at me. I'm not going to speak. Even in high school was always, I'm, climbing down under the desk because I didn't want to have to get called to do a presentation anywhere. So, kind of long story short, he sent me to instructor school, and it kind of took off from there. So I was, I guess, better part of 11 years of my career was doing that, which was good. I really enjoyed it. That was I'd say probably instructing was probably out of my career was probably one of the best parts of it. You get to see a lot of young guys come in the door, and you can see them in class that kind of struggle a little bit at the start of things. You see where the light bulb click, and you see them catch on to things and start reaching their potential. It's really a good feeling.
No, there's nothing like it when you see the light bulbs come on when you're instructing a class. That's the rewarding part of it. But to go back and kind of recap on what you're talking about there, Major Beckoff's a great guy. My time when I worked with him at the state, utmost respect for him. There are so many people that impact your career, that become mentors, or they see something in you and they help you grow, they help you expand. And that was kind of one of the cornerstones that I always took, was a pay it forward approach. That I was truly blessed in my career to have so many great mentors that just invested so much into me. When I became an instructor, I think when I graduated from the academy with FMCSA in 2002, I was instructing a Part A class the next week. It was that quick that, I got thrown into instructing. But it's all about, giving back and trying to help people grow and have a better understanding. It improves everything across the board. But that was the thing I always tried to do, was pay back, for the opportunities that I was afforded. And I feel like, at the end of the ride there, and, separating from the government this year, I feel like I did that. And I've also been truly blessed with mentors in industry over the years. I've learned so much more from the people in industry about how things really work, or how things, should work. That was one of the things when I did decide to retire. I reached out to a lot of those mentors in industry, and just let them know and told them thank you for everything that they had done and invested, because I never tried to have any kind of an adversarial relationship with I'm from the government. I'm here to help, and helping folks learn to comply the right way. And I was blessed to have a lot of people spend time and invest in me and teach me the right way. And it was a great partnership. It was a good ride, but yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you bring up mentorship and stuff like that. I guess one of the weird things about me and you is you were one of my mentors early on in my career.
I'm sorry, everybody.
Yeah, well, it's I was telling somebody the other day, I don't know, we got talking about us and talking about like how we met. I said, yeah, me and Clay been friends for 20 years. And I said, it's kind of funny. I said, the first time we met was he was actually the instructor for my general hazmat class, and that
was a class when my laptop got stolen.
That was actually the exact story I gave. Was the first time I met Clay involved the hazmat class, and his car getting broke into in Buckhead, and all stuff getting stolen out of it. So
yep. Instructor manuals somewhere in Atlanta. There was a crackhead with a hazmat instructor manual and a hazmat regulation book running around on the street. So yeah.
Well, kind of the funny thing about that is you talk about a crackhead or a meth head breaking in and stealing your hazmat stuff out of there, and it's like, well, maybe it's a public service, because the regulations say if you transport hazmat in commerce, you're subject to the regulations. Yep. It doesn't say it has to be legal commerce; it just says commerce.
That's true.
So
that is very true.
If you have a
there is case law to support.
Yeah, so if you have a rolling meth lab going down the street, you're technically a hazmat carrier at that point. So maybe they're just trying to make sure they're doing it legally.
Could be. So. Yeah, that's a real story there. That was true. You were in that class, and as I remember, you took the hazmat like a duck did the water. So you didn't have any problem.
For some reason, it just clicked with me. And I think it kind of goes back to why when I had the idea of doing this podcast, reached out to you, and I was like, it's one thing I've noticed since I've retired is, like I say, instructing was a good part of my career. I love doing it. I love teaching. I love all aspects of training. I taught everything from North American Standard Part A, which is the driver inspection part of, or what we call level 3 inspection, all the way up to level 6, which was the enhanced radiological inspection part of it. So, pretty
Uh-huh.
much anything that falls in between, I ended up teaching, and, even as far as teaching at the FMCSA Academy on a few occasions. So, you talk about mentors in the industry too. I know we did a lot of outreach and stuff. And I did a lot of, speaking engagements with people like the Georgia Motor Trucking Association and some of their events and stuff like that. One recurring theme that I saw throughout all this was a lot of misunderstanding or misapplication of the regulations on this. And a lot of it is, we'll just call it, people get their information from a truck stop lawyer, and if you,
Exactly.
yeah, and if you don't know what a truck stop lawyer is, that's the guy that hangs around in the truck stop, and he's going to tell you what the law says, how the law should apply, and what you better be doing so you don't get in trouble. And if you ask them, well, what's your training and your background on this, is, well, I watched CSI one time, so I learned a little bit about the law then. And it's like, crap, here we go. So and I think you would agree on this. I spent from 2005 to I made lieutenant in 2014. So those 9 years there, I spent pretty much as a full time auditor slash investigator.
Right.
Going into carriers, which was a big part of your career too. And it was kind of funny because you were actually the one that had to approve my investigations when I sent them in. But I think the bulk of what we would find during these audits and investigations was, it was not so much as the companies wanting to try to skirt around things, as they just really didn't know what to
No.
do. And our running joke we used to say is, well, these regulations are written for lawyers by lawyers, so unless you have a law degree, good luck trying to figure them out. So that was
They can be very complex sometimes and not easily understandable. And I mean, when we talk about the hazmat regulations, and this is one of the key points I bring up all the time, they're so clearly written and so easy to understand. That's why there's 7,900 letters of interpretation that have been issued. So yeah, it's clear as mud, and it's the same with the FMCSRs as well.
Yeah. And I mean, you bring up a good point there. Is it's not only that we had the regulations to deal with, but we got the massive amount of interpretations that go with it also.
Yeah.
And and unless you really dig into it, this, and especially when you get into the hazmat regulations, because I mean, at least under the they call the FMCSRs, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. At least if you have a printed book of those, you have a section of interpretations at the end of every section. If you go to the hazmat
Yes.
book, you have a hazmat book. And then it is up to you to then go to the FMSA, the Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration's website, and search for the interpretations. Well, you don't know what interpretation you're searching for, so how are you supposed to find it?
Well, and then it becomes even more difficult because I can go back to a venture in a time in 2004 to 2006 timelines. I mean, you remember the old song "Dueling Banjos" from the movie Deliverance? So yeah, good classic from 1972 there. But we had dueling interpretations going on at that point. When we were dealing with 406 cargo tanks, there was no less than 3 or 4 interpretations that all contradicted each other that were issued as to whether or not a double bulkhead void could be plugged or not. One of my great mentors, Dave Feather, who was with the Virginia State Police, had written numerous times for interpretations on this. And it was like, well, this week you can plug them, this week you can't, because everything was confusing. So those of us trying to instruct cargo tank, it became an actual nightmare. And then the people in the industry, because it all based on how they asked the question. And then based on how they asked the question is based on what the answer they get back from PHMSA. So that's the danger with the interpretation. You have to make sure it fits that exact situation that you're dealing with. But absolutely, they are much clearer in the motor carrier safety regulations. But I will give kudos to PHMSA in the past 4 years. That really began a process to streamline it and actually start publishing frequently asked questions in the Federal Register that cover a lot of the things. That's led to a little bit of streamlining. So there is progress being made, and that's a good thing. But it moves at the speed of government.
Yeah, and that's one thing I'll give too. I know I don't. really like getting into, political commentary and political debates with people, but that's one thing you've kind of seen a move here, and I'll say like during President Trump's first administration and going into his second one is really trying to put a pause on some regulations and stuff. And, for the regulation, for, every regulation going in, X amount of regulations need to come out. And, I will, I will be one of the first ones to say that. I mean, I think, and this comes from a background of 20 years of law enforcement dealing with this, I think trucking is heavily over-regulated. Do there need to be safety regulations? Absolutely. Because I mean, you're driving an 80,000 pound truck down the road. I mean, being a driving instructor, for the state and dealing with commercial vehicles is, there's stopping distances, reaction time, things like this need to go. If you're driving an 80,000 pound truck down the road, there needs to be a little bit. It needs to be a little tighter guidance on who can drive, who's qualified, how long you can drive, especially when you mix hazmat into it. I mean, if you're driving a 406 down, DOT 406 cargo tank going down the road, carrying 8 or 9,000 gallons of gasoline, I mean, you got a rolling bomb going there. But, at the same time, like you said, I mean, just the conflicting letters of interpretation. Like I remember we had one, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was in part 383 dealing with CDLs and who has to have a passenger endorsement, who doesn't, under what circumstance. And it's like, well, if you, like you say, I mean, if you stop this truck today, got to have, or this vehicle today's got to have a passenger endorsement. You stop it tomorrow, they don't. But next Friday they do. Which one is it? I mean, it's just it gets to the point that it is very overregulated, and I think that's where we, as roadside inspectors, as investigators, I think that's where we found a lot of issues at with companies was, like I say, they didn't know. And I think not today, but one of the topics I want to get into down the road in another episode is talking about post-crash stuff. What does a carrier need to do, from the time you get notification that the driver's in a crash to the time you move on, man, because there are so many regulations there, so much if this, then that, based on, the time, location, what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. It can get pretty convoluted pretty quick. That was kind of my idea for this podcast was like, well, why don't, from our experience, I mean, we've both been considered, we're both instructors, we've both been considered subject matter experts in this, so why don't we take all the questions that we get and just try to do a deep dive into these and, try to help people understand what's going on out there, understand what it is, because, I think one thing that people don't realize is, especially when it comes into a crash scenario, say a driver gets in a crash, serious injury, worst case scenario, there's a fatality involved with it. Then the whole one call, that's all starts coming in on that. And, it's not just, okay, well, hey, what was I doing at that moment? At that moment in time, what did the driver do? It all boils down to what was the company's hiring practice when they hired this driver? Was he qualified to drive based on the federal regulations? There's a lot of questions that come into that. There's a lot of questions that come in. Okay, well, what do I have to maintain as a file to say that this guy is qualified to drive? How long do I have to maintain that? Because what I need to prove it, because, I think the largest civil lawsuit I've seen that I'm aware of that came out of this was, the plaintiff was seeking right around $1 billion in damages from a fatal crash. That's pretty steep.
That's a nuclear verdict.
Yeah, it's a nuclear verdict. Now, I mean, I'm not, I'm not like you. I don't have that kind of money sitting around on my couch cushion. So, that'd be a little.
You obviously have me confused with someone else.
So,
when I open my wallet, George Washington's eyes blink. He hasn't seen daylight in so long.
Well, I've never seen George Washington in my wallets, man. So I won't be able to help you out with that one.
But, yeah, no, you got the Ben Franklin's in yours. I just got $1 bills. I don't have C notes.
And I'm just happy to have some Monopoly money in mine. But yeah, that was kind of my thoughts on this. Is let's talk about what we've seen in the industry. Talk about issues that we've seen, questions that we get. What can we put?
I think the word that you used earlier, misinformation. I mean, that's the thing. It's clear up the misinformation that's out there, because we all know there's so much, and it comes from a litany of places. Like you said, it comes from the truck stop lawyer that knows everything. It comes from the inspector that maybe new or may misquote something, and then it grows on the CB. You just get misinformation out there. And then, of course, you had the TV element where somebody sees something on TV and they believe it's real. They solve all the world's problems in 30 minutes.
Oh yeah, no doubt. And and you brought up a good point earlier too about having mentors in the industry.
Huh?
One thing every time, because I went, I want to say from 2011 to when I retired in 2020. I was, pretty much the main instructor for the state for commercial vehicle stuff. Because a lot of the older guys
Yeah.
that we come up under have retired that we're instructing. And it's one thing I would tell the guys in the class, especially the new guys coming in, and then especially I would hit on when we got to teaching them hazmat inspections, was the driver is your best friend. Because and I tell the industry that also is like, from my standpoint, hey, I'm a lieutenant with the Department of Public Safety out here doing commercial vehicle enforcement. I have to know the broad spectrum of everything that I'm going to run across. This driver knows what he does in and out every day. Okay. So if you stop somebody, you're doing a roadside inspection, you got a question about it, that driver is your absolute best resource. And that's one thing I try to stress to the guys all the time was, if you look at something, you got a question about it, ask the driver. This should not be an adversarial relationship.
Not at all.
Yeah, it should be. And I know from a driver standpoint or from a carrier standpoint, a lot of things come up. Well, hey, we feel like there's this guy was nitpicking these violations and stuff like this. And, one thing I tried to explain to the carriers, from the enforcement standpoint, and I think you would agree with this, is we get kind of put in a bad spot on there. Because I'll give you just an example. If I stop a truck and I do an inspection on there, and I see a side marker light out on it, okay, and I'll make a choice at that point. I'm not gonna put this on an inspection. I'm just gonna tell the driver, just get this fixed when you get to where you're going. Okay, all right. Well, we do the report. I write up no violations. Goes down the road. He gets involved in a crash. Okay, let's say catastrophic crash. Okay, so then you have the not only post crash inspection going on, possibly an accident reconstruction that's going out there through everything, but then you have the civil part that comes in with the retired reconstructionist that works for the attorney's office now coming in, and that they find that okay, here's all the violations that we found on this truck after the crash, and hey, all these happened because of the crash. But we found some lighting violations on here that existed prior to the crash. Okay, well, all of a sudden now, 5 years down the road, I'm getting subpoenaed as the officer who just inspected that truck, 5 minutes before it crashed. And the attorney asked me, "It's okay, Lieutenant Moore, this violation was found to exist prior to the crash, but you didn't document it on there." And my answer is, well, it's a minor violation. I just, told the driver to get it fixed. Don't worry, minor. And then the question comes back to me, well, so you have a decision what violations are minor and what violations are major and what you put on the inspection report. So what else on this truck did you consider a minor violation that you didn't write up, that if you had it written up, my client's loved one might be alive today? And from an enforcement side, it really puts you in a bind on that, because some things you see this, I really don't want to write this up because it's so minor. On the flip side is how do I cover my rear end down the road if I start getting asked those questions?
It's a complex situation too when you deal with that, and that's become the norm because someone wants to take something that's very minor that has absolutely nothing to do contributing to whatever's happened and make them out of a molehill. It can vary from violation to violation, but that also plays into misinformation. Is it something that was really required? I've seen the same thing you're talking about and dealt with it firsthand with like retroreflective sheeting on trailers. When that started becoming required in the 80s, you would see, people challenge things or get upset. I've had that happen to me on a post-crash inspection where some attorney was mad because I didn't cite some lighting violations. But the problem was with his argument was it didn't meet what the regulations were. And I'm like, well, you're absolutely correct. It does not meet what the regulation says, but there's no requirement to go back and retrofit a trailer from 1956 with that lighting. And, he's all flabbergasted by that. But That was a 1956 South Georgia log trailer that was involved in a fatal crash. It depends. It all boils down to applicability. That's the number one thing. You can't, you have to put them in the book first, and then you have to make it, make it understandable to what regulations apply.
Yeah, and that's kind of a good segue into one of the first topics I thought that we'd hit for episode one of this is what lighting devices are required on a truck. Because look, hey, I'm as guilty as anybody. If you looked at my patrol car, back in the day, if Hartsville Jackson had ever had a power outage, I could have parked out there and guided planes in for the rest of the night with as many blue lights as I put on my car. Okay, I like lights. Okay, so hey, if I was a truck driver, all I can say is hold my sweet tea and stand by, because this is gonna get good. So so that's one of the questions that gets out there a lot. Again, misinformation. And if you want to start an argument, this is when I teach classes for industry and stuff, this always kicks one off. Is, well, if I put chicken lights on my truck and one of those chicken lights goes out, that's a violation. And I've seen it written up on the enforcement side. I get asked about it by the industry, and my answer is, well, not necessarily. And they're like, well, what do you mean? If it's on there, it's got to work. Is that what the regulation says?
That's the key. What does the book say? When you go into regulations, what lights are required? Well, guess what? There's all kind of neat little pictures and figures in there with all kind of numbers that refer to the different kind of lights, and it tells you what kind of lights are required.
Yeah, and one thing, and hey, both of us being from the government, we love acronyms. So the two, and even doing industry classes now, the two that I use when I taught, on the state and federal level, and when I teach industry classes now, is RTFB and DMSU.
That's right.
RTFB, read the federal book. Okay, DMSU, don't make stuff up. Okay, so you talk about lights and say, oh, well, if it's on there, it's got to work. Well, to know, okay, well, does it have to work? Well, we got to go to the regulation and look. So, if you go into regulations, and this gets into part, 393 of Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations.
I thought it was a certainly fun reading.
Oh, well, yeah, it can be. So, yeah, it is certainly fun reading. I always tell everybody, if you have a bad case of insomnia, just break out the federal regulations and start reading it, and you'll be out in no time.
Or can't find readily.
That's definitely more like it. You dang sure can't find a regulation when you need it. Or we just call that, just can't find regulations. Yeah, definitely CFR for that. So, but we'll go in this, and like you said, all right. So 393.11 gives us this nice table that tells us, what lights are required, what color they have to be, where they have to be located on the vehicle, and what vehicles they need to be on. Okay, so if I go look at the table in there, and it tells me, hey, I got to have 2 headlamps on here. They got to be white. They got to be on the front of the vehicle. They're required on trucks less than 80 inches, trucks more than 80 inches, truck tractors, all that good stuff on there. Okay. Well, you look at that. Okay. Yeah, that's required there. Okay. Then you go to 393.9, which is, it's kind of weird. It's you have the section that tells you what lights you need, and then you have to back up to see which ones are actually required. So
yeah, exactly.
That's typical.
Or which ones have to work.
Yeah. Typical government fashion on here. Okay.
Yeah. We're going backwards to go forward.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one step forward, 2 steps backwards is the government
there you
way.
Go. Yeah. So that's the Potomac 2-step.
Yeah, Potomac 2-step. I like that one. So yeah, but if I go to 393.9, it says the title of the section is Lamps Operable, Prohibition of Obstruction of Lamps and Reflectors. And paragraph A on here says all lamps required by this subpart shall be capable of being operated at all times. And and one thing I always told our guys in class is, if you read that, it sounds like, well, every light that's on my truck's got to work. Okay, well, did you happen to read that third word in that sentence that says all lamps required? What's required? Well, if you go to that table in 393.11, it tells you exactly what's required. And so one of my favorite examples about this is, if we look at the front of a truck tractor going down the road, okay, and
are we gonna talk about the license plate on the bumper?
We'll save that for another episode, because that tag is pretty good on that one. But one of my favorite things is, let me preface this. You and I will use terms like truck tractor and stuff like this a lot, because we're just so used to using this. But everybody knows what a tractor trailer is going down the road. There is a difference between a truck and a truck tractor. A truck tractor is designed to pull a trailer. That's the only thing it can do. Okay, a truck is designed to carry a load by itself and can pull a trailer. So I always like to tell everybody, doing classes, talking about stuff, is we use the official terms a lot just because we're so used to doing that. But this is, what everything encompasses on there.
Yeah.
But one of my favorite examples is the track trailer going down the road. You look at the front of the truck tractor. All right, by the table on 39311, I'm required to have 3 identification lamps in the center and a clearance lamp on the outside, left side and right side. So I'm required to have 5 lights up there total. Okay. Well, people like putting, they like putting a strip all the way across there. Hey,
Yeah.
like I said, I was a light fanatic when I worked at the state. The more lights, the better. Okay, so I have no issue with that whatsoever. Okay, well, out of those 5 lights, what's required? If I go to my table on 39311, it says 3
Bingo.
identification lights in the center, clearance lights, 1 on each side as far as part is practicable to mark the overall width of the vehicle. Okay.
Can they be purple?
I believe if we go to 39311, the front ones have to be amber.
There you go. Yeah, it's in the book, right? RTFB,
yeah,
right?
just go back and read the book. Yeah, if it's front, if it's front, it's got to be amber. If it's on the back, it's got to be red.
Hey, who'd have thunk it?
Yeah, pretty straightforward on that. Okay, but what's required on that? Okay,
Yeah.
but here's the thing I stress to everybody is you look at that paragraph A and all lamps required must be capable of operating at all times. Okay, period. There's one more sentence on there that nobody ever reads. They stop right there. Okay. The next sentence is this paragraph shall not be construed to require that any auxiliary or additional lamp be capable of operating at all times. Okay.
Amazing, is it that is actually right there in black and white in the book?
Yeah, it's a federal regulation. It says, hey, you know what? If you put these extra lights up there, that's fine. If they don't work, as long as you have the minimum required lights as required by 393.11, you've met what the law says.
Not exactly.
And so I actually had this come up. Not well. I guess it's been a little bit now. But I would get these. Got a question in from from a friend of mine on the enforcement side. Not gonna call any names on there. But
not if they're still currently working for the government. We don't want to get anyone in trouble, right?
Yeah, we're not gonna call names or agencies or anything like this. But he calls me and he says, "Hey, I want to ask you a question." He's like, "Because you were an instructor on this for a lot of years, I want to get your opinion on something." I said, "Yeah, go ahead with it." I got a family member. He's in the trucking business, and he buys this truck. They're straight trucks, actually. Well, we'll call it their dump trucks. All right. So he gets them from a specific dealer. Well, as part of this dealer, when he does his deal, on the back of the truck where the identification lights go, instead of just putting the 3 right there, he puts a strip with 5 lights across it in the center. Okay. And then we still have the clearance lights on the outside. Everything's good on there. So he gets stopped by a roadside inspector. Again, I'm not going to call the state or the agency. Gets stopped by a roadside inspector. One of those 5 lights is out. So now he gets a violation for 393.9A for an inoperable required lamp because, by grannies, if the light's there, it better be working. So he calls said friend of mine and says, "Hey, this is what I got." But what, my friend is like, "Well, no, that's not the case. As long as the required lights are there, they're there." So they file a data queue with the state. And for those that don't know what a data queue is it's I'll always explain it like this. If I stop you and write you a speeding ticket and you don't agree with the speeding ticket, you have a date that you can go in front of a judge and explain your case to the judge and why you feel like you should not have received a ticket or why you should not be found guilty. And then, plead your case and the judge is going to decide guilty or not guilty. All right. So a data queue is basically the same thing for a roadside inspection. If you feel like the violation is not fair, not just, you don't deserve it, you can appeal that violation. So they file a data queue on it. Data queue goes to the state. The person handling data queues at the time happens to be an instructor. Comes back and says, "No, this is a valid violation." So I'm like, "What? Can you repeat that?" And he's like, "Yeah, this is what happened." I was like, "Oh my God." So he asked me my opinion about it. I said, "Well," I'll tell you what. I said, we'll write a letter up and send to them, breaking down verbatim what the regulation says in there and addressing it spot on." And they still refuse to budge on it. And I'm just thinking to myself, it's like, it's in black and white right here. How do you not know this? On top of that, you're an instructor. Not only are you an inspector, but you're teaching guys how to do this. I mean, come on, man, seriously. So I just, like you said, I mean, it's not only truck stop lawyers that you deal with, but there's guys on the enforcement side that have issues with the applicability and the understanding of it also.
Well, there is, and a lot of it And you know this very well from your work history, as I do too. There comes a time, especially when you come out of the field and you start doing other duties or you promote into management and you have other responsibilities, you're not doing everything like you were, to where you're touching it every day. You're doing the inspections every day. You're going from doing, 1,400 roadside inspections a year down to, maybe 100. So, with anything, if you're not out there doing it, you lose your proficiency or your touch in it. As far as on the instruction side of it too, without those clear and consistent updates and collaboration with others, that's why networking is so important. That's why, having those mentors that are the go-to people, because again, I was blessed when I began instructing to have a couple of the greatest instructors, in my opinion, that have ever been out there to teach me and to learn and to partner with and go and co-instruct with. And, those experiences really helped me and then enabled me to pay it forward to another generation, and in the years and years I instructed. But you're absolutely right. And then also, it doesn't take much from inspectors from, other states to get to communicating with each other. And sometimes they, which this will be a topic for another day as well, but the state adoption of the regulation may vary from state to state. There may be something different and they get it confused from time to time. So these things happen as well. And that's where the misinformation comes from. And I have to say, 31 years I dealt with motor carrier safety. Probably the two biggest pieces of misinformation that I dealt with, especially when you're out there doing inspections or dealing with everything. Number one is the drivers all freak out and they're upset or talk about, well, it's a federal law. You can't carry a firearm in a commercial motor vehicle. I don't know how that one got started or where it went, but no, there is no federal regulation that covers that. No, there is nothing, that impacts it. They dream up all of these other things. And then the second thing that just used to drive me bonkers, and in fact, it drove me so crazy, I decided to do something about it. And that's these crazy drivers. Back in the late 90s, when we do port details in Savannah, get out there and you tell them, hey, we need to break the seal on the truck. You can't break my seal unless you got a U.S. Marshal. I need a U.S. Marshal here. You can't do this. You got to be a U.S. Marshal. And I'm like, stand by, buddy. I got a U.S. Marshal. Go to the trunk of the car and get that 4-foot set of bolt cutters that's got U.S. Marshal stenciled on the handles of it. There's your U.S. Marshal, buddy. But that misinformation's been out there for years, and it just, it goes from generation to generation, it seems like, and it always seems to come up again. And then the rights forms that, when you stop a driver, ask to look at their logbook, or now their ELD, I'm dating myself, and they hand you a piece of paper that says, you're violating their Fourth Amendment rights, and it refers to Tennessee versus Garner. And I'm like, well, no, that basically says I just can't shoot you in the back. That's what that's saying. But that's what their piece of paper says. But yeah, no, I agree 100%. I mean, it's what does the regulation say? And in your point in filing a data queue challenge, the key there is stick to the regulation. What does the regulation specifically say? And, I will say that on my experience, working with FMCSA, whether it was doing state programs or being a DA or whatever, but when you look at the data queue process, the states are doing a very good job of training their inspectors on like what the top 10 data queue violations are to make sure that there's not a misunderstanding. And then they do try to clear that up. And again, that goes back to the partnership between, enforcement and industry. Have that open line of communication.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest keys to it right there is the open line of communication and the partnership between both sides. Because I mean, at the end of the day, from an enforcement side, what is my job? My job is, I always looked at it, my job is to make sure that the drivers are doing their job like they're supposed to. Okay,
Yeah.
what's their job? Their job is to move their freight from point A to point B in a safe manner. Okay, at the end of the day, both of our goal is to go home at the end of our
Mhm.
job when our job is done. Okay, and if that's our goal, well, that means, hey, I don't get involved in a crash today. Because I may not go home at that point. I think you and I both worked enough fatalities and stuff over the years, that's something that you never want to see. And
No,
the and not just from the enforcement side, the lasting impact, which that's a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down on that, but just from the driver's side is, like I say, is this stuff that can carry on for years after the crash. Dealing with lawsuits and things like this. And I always tell everybody, it's like you can't prevent a lawsuit. You can't stop a lawsuit from happening. It's the if you're involved in a fatal crash, the probability of a lawsuit coming up is almost 100%.
it's about 150%.
Yeah, but what can you do? Well, you could take steps.
Mm.
You can make sure you're abiding by the regulations, so that when the questions come up, you can answer is, yeah, I did what the regulation said, and a lot of it puts it on the driver to know the regulation. And
Well,
yeah,
go ahead. I'm sorry. I cut you off.
well, yeah, and I was going to say, I think like the lighting thing here is a good example of, if you just read the regulation, it's there, but don't when you read the regulation, don't stop once okay, I've got the answer that I want, so I'm going to stop here. No, read the entire regulation, because at the end of the day, you may get the answer that you don't want, but
Mhm.
is it the answer that you need? It's kind of like when your parents made you eat your vegetables growing up. You dang sure didn't want the broccoli, but you needed the broccoli. So it's kind of the same thing. Or I didn't, or you didn't want to brush your teeth before you went to bed. I got an 18-year-old I still argue with about doing that, but you don't want to, but you need to. So it's like I say, it all goes back in acronyms. RTFB, man, read the federal book and know what it
Exactly,
says.
without a doubt, without a doubt. And I mean, when I started doing compliance investigations back in 1998, that was one of the things that I've always told the companies. Just remember, the book is what the regulations say you have to do. And if you're not doing it, it's easy to tell a story to a civil jury with 6 little old ladies on it that, you're the big bad company and you did all these evil, bad, rotten things intentfully when there really was no intention. And you just have to put it in a perspective, because at the end of the day, you're trying to reduce your risk by complying.
Well, one of the things, and we're kind of getting toward the end of our time today, but one of the things I normally share with everybody that was told to me by one of our investigators when I first started my career. He was actually with our Office of Professional Standards, or the official name for our IA department. Was everybody has a
You
story.
spent a lot of time there, didn't you?
Well, okay. Actually, in all fairness, he worked out the post that I worked out of. So yeah, so I did spend a lot of time there. Not downstairs in the basement though, thankfully. But no, he told me, it's like, everybody's got a story. It's just how that story's told. And I think when you look at it at the end of the day, it applies to a driver just the way it applies to us on the enforcement side. Hey, just like you said, I mean, the regulations give you the minimum that you have to do. And so like, one example I think I'll give out of one of the cargo securement classes I teach now is, hey, I can look here under 303.100, look at my load securement requirements, and it says by law I need one strap on this pallet. Okay, well that means that's the minimum I gotta have. Okay, what if that strap breaks going down the road? What you gonna do? You're out of service and you got an unsecured load there. What if it falls off before you can get stopped? What's going to happen then? So, but if you put two straps on there and now you
Uh-huh.
lose one, you're still secured. You're still meeting the legal requirements. Now it gives you time to get off the road and get stopped. So there again, something happens. How's that story going to be told? Was it told that you did the bare minimum to get by, or is your story going to be told that you went above and beyond what the regulations require?
That's exactly right.
And I ask everybody, hey, okay, what do you think is going to sound better to a jury? You
Uh-huh.
skated by the skin of your teeth, or you went above and beyond. So that's what I say. That's what I say. That's was kind of my goal of wanting to do this podcast, was kind of get into it of, hey, what does the regulation say, and what is what? What does it say? Load securement. I always say, hey, you look at one strap on there. Two is one and one is none.
There you go.
So know what it says. Like I say, I think the one we talked about today, just on the lighting violations, I think that's one. If you know what the regulation says, do you meet the regulation? If you do, hey, man, that's awesome. If you don't know what the regulation says, so you can address it and fix it, so you don't get a violation.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's very commonly cited. You do see that all the time. So no, I think that was a good first topic to kind of tread water off into this.
Yeah. So yeah, and I know that pretty much about wraps us up for today's. I tell everybody, appreciate everybody tuning in to Highways and Hazmat with our catchy name there we decided to come up with. not to everybody, if you found, hey, if you think these episodes are useful, this is kind of the format that we're going to be following is, looking at a topic and regulations, pretty much every week. Share it with your friends in the industry, drivers that safety directors that if you have any topics or any suggestions that you would like to be covered, our email address is podcast, podcast, at southeastconsulting.net. So with that, we'll say until the next episode, stay informed, stay safe, and we'll see you on the road.
This, my friend.